25 years. That's how long I'd been Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, wife of David Mitchell, the man I thought I knew better than I knew myself. People said we were the example of what marriage should look like, as steady, respectful, full of quiet understanding. They weren't wrong, at least not in the beginning. We built our lives on routine, morning coffee, a goodbye kiss, the sound of his car pulling out of the driveway. Love, over time, became comfortable, like an old sweater you wear without noticing anymore. I used to think that kind of peace was the reward for surviving the chaos of youth. I didn't realize that sometimes comfort is just another word for distance. When our daughter Grace left for her new job in another city, the house grew silent in a way I hadn't expected. I thought it would be nice time for us to reconnect, to talk again without interruptions. But it was as if we'd forgotten how. We ate dinner together, yet it felt like sharing a table with a polite stranger. He scrolled through emails between bites. I asked questions he barely heard. Still, I convinced myself this was normal. Every marriage changes. Maybe this was just what growing older together looked like, but I started noticing things, small, insignificant details that didn't fit. His new cologne, too strong for his usual taste. His shirts pressed more often, his hair neater, his laughter returning like a guest I hadn't seen in years. He started coming home later, apologizing softly, blaming deadlines. I didn't doubt him at first. David had always been responsible, the man who never forgot anniversaries, who fixed the leaking tap before I even mentioned it. He wasn't careless. That's why I didn't see it as deceit. I saw it as stress, as fatigue, as everything except what it truly was. The night of Grace's graduation party came back to me later, how he'd stood in the corner, half smiling, checking his phone between toasts. When I asked who it was, he said a client, then pocketed the phone like it burned. Back then, I thought he just wanted to escape the noise. Now I know he was already slipping away. I remember the early days when our love was simple, two broke kids sharing burnt toast and big dreams. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and somehow that was enough. We'd fall asleep holding hands and wake up believing the world couldn't touch us. Over the years, life softened those edges. Mortgages, responsibilities, parenting, they built walls around what once felt endless. I didn't blame him for that. I didn't even notice when we stopped saying "I love you" out loud. It was replaced by reminders about bills, groceries, and dentist appointments. That's how most marriages die, not with shouting, but with silence. Still, I never thought he'd betray me. David wasn't that kind of man. He didn't flirt, he didn't stay out drinking, he wasn't restless. But restlessness doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it hides behind long sighs, late meetings, and the need for something unnamed. Around that time, he mentioned a new colleague, Emily Ross. I remember the first time he said her name, casual, almost dismissive. "She's just joined the firm," he'd said, pouring himself coffee. I didn't think twice. Weeks later, her name came up again. She was funny, he said. Sharp. Knew how to lighten a stressful day. The way he described her, subtle admiration tucked inside harmless praise, made me uneasy, though I pushed it aside. What kind of wife suspects her husband for talking about a coworker? The truth is, I ignored the signs because facing them meant questioning everything I'd built my life on. It's easier to live in a fragile illusion than to shatter it yourself. I started pretending not to care when he came home late. I told myself love was about trust, not interrogation. I told myself marriages survived worse. I told myself lies just to stay calm. He changed in ways only someone who'd watched him for decades could notice. He smiled more, but not at me. He'd hum while shaving, like a man with a secret too pleasant to hide. He'd look at his phone and his eyes would soften, eyes that hadn't softened for me in years. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, who wants to believe the person they've shared half their life with could drift towards someone else without a word? One evening, I asked him if he was happy. He looked surprised, as if the question itself was foreign. Then he smiled faintly and said, "Of course." That single hesitation between my question and his answer was the moment something inside me broke. But I smiled back anyway, pretending not to notice the crack widening between us.I and the quiet of our bedroom. Lying beside him, I listened to his breathing and realized how far away he already was. Love isn't just about presence, it's about energy, attention, warmth. His body was there, but his heart was elsewhere, invisible but gone. I could feel it the way you feel a draft in a sealed room, subtle but undeniable. Looking back, the truth was always visible, scattered in the smallest details. The way he dressed better for work, the way he spoke softer when answering his phone, the way his laughter returned but never reached me. I had a choice, to confront or to cling. I chose the latter, because love, even when wounded, doesn't die easily. It waits. It hopes. It believes in miracles that never come. That night, as I watched him sleep, I realized how fragile love becomes when trust fades. I wanted to wake him, to ask who he'd become, but the words stayed trapped behind my teeth. So I kissed his shoulder like I'd done for 25 years and whispered good night, unaware I was already saying goodbye to the man I married.
It started with a single message. "Did you get home safely that night?" Simple, polite, nothing wrong on the surface. I stared at it longer than I should have before replying. "Yes. Thank you again." That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, he messaged again, this time sharing a photo of the sky outside his office. Gray clouds like the night he drove me home. "Looks like rain again," he wrote. I replied with a smiling emoji, pretending it meant nothing, but deep down I knew something was changing. It became a pattern. Little exchanges that grew into conversations about everything and nothing. He asked about my day, about my old hobbies, about books I said I liked years ago. He remembered details Hassan had forgotten. I began waiting for his messages the way I once waited for my husband's. It wasn't about attraction yet, not exactly, it was about attention. A quiet warmth that started filling the spaces where silence had lived for too long. 81st, I tried to convince myself that it was innocent. We were friends, that was all. Saad was simply kind, someone who listened without judgment. But even kindness can become dangerous when it starts meaning more than it should. I found myself checking my phone while cooking, smiling at texts I couldn't explain. Hassan would ask what I was laughing at, and I'd say, just something online. A small lie, harmless, yet heavy. Hassan was still the same, loving, distracted, tired. Our conversations revolved around bills, meals, and his deadlines. Every evening, I'd sit with him at dinner, nodding along, pretending I wasn't somewhere else in my mind. There were moments when guilt would creep in, sharp and fleeting, but I'd silence it quickly. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I'd remind myself. I wasn't meeting him, I wasn't hiding in dark corners. I was just talking. Then came the day he asked if I'd finished my painting. I told him I hadn't even started. He sent a picture of a half-done sketch from his desk, saying, I tried something after our talk that night. It was messy but beautiful, like a reflection of the chaos we were both quietly feeding. I stared at that sketch for a long time before typing back, "You're better than you think." He replied, "Maybe you inspire me." I didn't know how to answer that. Days turned into weeks. Sometimes we'd talk late into the night about things we'd never confessed to anyone else, how tired we were of pretending, how easy it was to be misunderstood by the people closest to us. He told me he hadn't felt connected to anyone in years. I didn't say it, but I understood him completely. There's a kind of loneliness that grows quietly between routine and responsibility, and when someone notices it, the relief feels dangerously close to love. The first time I felt real fear was when Hassan mentioned inviting Saad for dinner. My heart skipped a beat. I smiled, pretending enthusiasm, but inside I panicked. The thought of the three of us sharing a table felt unbearable. When Saad arrived that evening, everything in me tensed. He was polite, respectful, and distant. He barely looked at me, as if our messages didn't exist. That restraint only deepened the pull. The more he avoided me, the more my thoughts tangled around him. After he left, Hassan said, "He's a good guy. Reminds me of when I was younger." I smiled faintly and nodded, but the words stung. Saad wasn't just a colleague anymore, he had become a mirror showing me everything missing from my marriage. Our messages continued, but now with careful pauses. He'd disappear for days, then return with something simple: "You were quiet last time." Each message felt like a spark I tried to smother, yet secretly missed when it was gone. Guilt began to settle like dust, soft, constant, impossible to clean completely. Then came the night everything changed. Hassan was away on a business trip. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. I was scrolling through my phone when his message appeared. "Sometimes I wish you weren't married." I froze. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. Because a part of me had been waiting for those words. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down, but I couldn't move. It was as if he'd voiced something I'd already thought but never dared to admit. I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkness. Every conversation, every shared thought had led to this. We hadn't touched, hadn't even stood too close, but the boundary had already been crossed in silence. I knew it, and so did he. I thought about Hassan, his familiar scent, his tired eyes, his trust. The guilt pressed harder, but still, I didn't delete the chat. I couldn't. The next morning, Saad didn't text, and neither did I. The silence between us was louder than any words we'd shared. I went through my day pretending nothing had changed, but inside, I felt something collapse, a mix of shame and longing that refused to fade. I kept telling myself I'd stop, that I'd draw a line. But deep down, I knew the truth. The moment I started waiting for his messages more than my husband's, I'd already crossed it. That night, as I lay beside Hassan, who had just returned and was peacefully asleep, I whispered to myself the truth I couldn't say aloud. I hadn't betrayed him with my body, but my heart had already chosen its silence.
When he came home that evening, nothing in his face suggested guilt, yet everything about him carried it. The tired smile, the distracted eyes, the shallow attempt to sound normal. I set his dinner on the table and spoke of nothing. I had spent days rehearsing the confrontation in my mind, but when the moment arrived, words felt unnecessary. I let him eat in silence, watched the man I had shared 25 years with pretend that everything was fine. When he looked up and asked why I was so quiet, I reached into my drawer and placed a photograph on the table. It was the one I had taken from my car the day I saw him with her. He froze, fork suspended mid-air. There was no denial, no question, no defense. Only silence, thick, suffocating, final. How long? I asked. My voice didn't shake. His did. He muttered something about mistakes, about weakness, about how it just happened. That phrase, "it just happened," is what breaks you most. As if betrayal were an accident, not a choice. He said her name like a confession, his shoulders heavy under the truth he'd carried too long. Emily. Hearing it aloud felt like confirmation that my nightmares had been real all along. He spoke about loneliness, about feeling invisible, about how routine turned love into obligation. I listened, not out of compassion but out of curiosity. I wanted to understand the man he had become. He said he hadn't planned to hurt me, that she was just someone who made him feel alive again. I almost laughed. The arrogance of that reasoning. To destroy something sacred just to feel a spark, you extinguish yourself. When he finally stopped talking, I said only one thing: you didn't just cheat on me, David. You cheated on the years I believed in you. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Touch was meaningless now. The connection that once held us together had disintegrated into fragments of apology and disbelief. He tried to cry, but the tears felt late, performative. Regret after betrayal is not repentance, it's fear. Fear of losing what you took for granted. Fear of being exposed. I told him to leave. He hesitated, perhaps expecting a fight, maybe hoping for forgiveness. But I was too tired for either. I wanted peace, not closure. After he walked out, the house felt larger than ever. The silence that used to suffocate me now felt like air I could finally breathe. I sat there for hours, surrounded by the echoes of our life, the framed photos, the wedding china, the souvenirs from trips that suddenly felt like evidence of a lie. I cried once, not because I lost him, but because I realized I had already lost myself years before trying to hold on to something that was already fading, Grace found out weeks later. I tried to shield her, but truth travels faster than protection. She looked at me, tears in her eyes, and said she didn't know how to face him. I told her she didn't have to choose sides. She nodded, but her silence said otherwise. Her disappointment was heavier than my heartbreak. Watching her process what he'd done reminded me how betrayal never affects just two people, it ripples through every connection around it. David moved out soon after. He tried to call, sent messages filled with guilt, promises of therapy, change, repentance. I didn't reply. Not because I hated him, but because I no longer had anything left to say. The version of me who would have fought for him was gone. In her place stood a woman who finally understood that loyalty to someone who's already betrayed you is just another form of self-betrayal. Emily didn't last. I heard through someone at his office that she ended things. She wanted passion, not the weight of his regrets. The affair that burned so brightly in secrecy couldn't survive the light of reality. He was left with the ruins, his marriage, his daughter's trust, his self-respect. I sometimes wondered if he thought it was worth it, those moments of false happiness that cost him everything real. Months passed. I began learning how to exist again without being someone's wife. I started painting, something I hadn't done since Grace was born. Each stroke felt like reclaiming a part of me that had been silent too long. I traveled alone, stayed in small towns, wrote letters I never sent. Healing didn't come suddenly. It crept in slowly, through mornings that didn't hurt anymore and nights that felt peaceful instead of lonely. I realized healing isn't about forgetting, it's about remembering without pain. One afternoon, while cleaning, I found an old anniversary card from him, one written during our 10th year together. His handwriting was younger, full of conviction, forever, no matter what life throws at us. I smiled, not in bitterness but in gratitude. We did have forever once, our version of it, at least. It just ended earlier than I thought. When people ask if I'd ever take him back, I say no, not out of pride but clarity. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it means setting both of you free from what can't be repaired. I forgave him silently, not for him, but for me, to reclaim the energy he no longer deserved. I still see him sometimes, at family gatherings or on calls with Grace. He looks older now, not just in years but in spirit. His eyes carry the weight of choices that can't be undone. There's remorse there, genuine perhaps, but also acceptance. He knows what he lost, and I know what I gained, the strength to stand alone. People say betrayal changes you, and they're right. It strips you down until you meet yourself at your rawest form. It forces you to rebuild from the ashes of what you thought you'd never survive. I lost my husband, but I found my truth. Love didn't end, it simply changed direction. After 25 years, he cheated. But in the silence that followed, I learned the one truth that stayed. I had spent years loving someone who had forgotten how to love himself. And in losing him, I rediscovered the one person I had neglected the most, me. 3 months after he left, the house had stopped echoing his absence. The emptiness became familiar, like a silence that no longer begged to be filled. I learned to sleep without listening for the sound of his keys, learned to make dinner for one without feeling pity. Healing didn't come in waves, it came in fragments, moments where breathing no longer hurt. Every morning, I reminded myself that peace was not a gift someone gives you, it's something you take back after the storm has passed. The first time David called after leaving, I almost didn't answer. His voice was uncertain, softer than I remembered. He said he wanted to talk, to explain things he hadn't been able to before. I agreed, not because I needed closure but because I wanted to hear how a man justifies destroying 25 years of trust. We met in a cafe neither of us had been to before, neutral ground where our memories couldn't interfere. He looked older, defeated in a way that only regret can age a person. He said he missed home. I told him home isn't a place, it's the people who make you feel safe, and he had destroyed that long before he walked out. He tried to apologize again, his voice breaking in the middle of words that came too late. I didn't interrupt. I just listened, because sometimes silence says everything. When he asked if I hated him, I told him no. Hate requires too much energy, and I had already spent enough of my life giving him mine. He nodded, his eyes full of something that looked like sorrow but felt more like realization. For a brief moment, I almost pitied him. He had lost everything, all chasing something temporary. After that meeting, I stopped wondering why he did it. The reasons didn't matter anymore. Betrayal always disguises itself as justification, but it's just selfishness dressed as need. I stopped searching for meaning in his choices and started finding purpose in my own. I began volunteering at an art center, teaching painting to children. Their laughter filled the spaces his silence used to occupy. I painted again, and through color and brush strokes, I learned expression without words. Every canvas became a confession I didn't have to voice. Grace visited often. She was colder toward her father than she admitted, but time was softening her anger. She told me he'd been trying to reconnect, sending her messages she rarely answered. I didn't tell her to forgive him, I told her to decide when she was ready. Pain has its own schedule, and no one should rush it. Watching her navigate that balance between love and disappointment made me proud. She had inherited my strength, not my patience for broken promises. One evening, she asked if I ever thought about dating again. I laughed, not out of denial, but because the idea of romance no longer frightened or tempted me. I told her maybe one day, but for now, I was rediscovering myself, the parts that had been buried under years of compromise. She smiled and said she liked this version of me better. So did I. David continued reaching out over the next few months. Birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, small reminders that he still remembered. I didn't block him, but I never responded. Forgiveness doesn't always come with conversation, sometimes it comes with silence that refuses to reopen old wounds. I could have met him halfway, but why revisit a story that had already ended? The closure I needed didn't come from him, it came from realizing I didn't need him to validate my pain. There was a moment, months later, when I saw him unexpectedly at the grocery store. Our eyes met across the aisle, and for a second, it felt like time folded in on itself. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries both apology and acceptance. I nodded once and walked away. That single gesture said everything words never could. We had become strangers again, and that was okay. People around me began to notice the change. Friends said I seemed lighter, freer. I was. For years, I had measured my worth by how much love I could give. Now, I measured it by how much peace I could keep. Betrayal had been my breaking point, but it also became my turning point. Pain, when faced, becomes power. On what would have been our 26th anniversary, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, no longer mourning what was lost but honoring what survived. The love I once gave him had transformed into something quieter, steadier, a love for life, for truth, for myself. I realized love doesn't die when someone betrays you, it simply changes ownership. It becomes yours to protect. When I think of him now, I don't feel bitterness. I feel distance. He's part of a story that shaped me but no longer defines me. Every betrayal carries a hidden gift, the chance to rebuild without illusion. I rebuilt myself from the ground up, not as a wife, not as a victim, but as a woman who finally chose herself. People say time heals everything. It doesn't. Time doesn't heal, it reveals. It shows you what's worth holding on to and what needs to be left behind. It teaches you that forgiveness isn't letting someone back in, it's letting yourself move on. David once told me love was about sacrifice. I used to believe that. Now I know love is about balance, giving without losing yourself, forgiving without forgetting, and walking away when staying means abandoning your own peace. The truth is, betrayal didn't end me. It refined me. It stripped away illusions and left me with something stronger than trust, a self-respect. I no longer see our story as a tragedy, but as a lesson. Some endings are just beginnings in disguise. And as I sit here now, years later, I can finally say without hesitation, he cheated, but I survived. I healed. And for the first time in decades, that feels like enough.